The question hit Jennifer Walsh like debris from Flight 47 all over again. Standing at the Family Feud podium in her simple black dress, the same color she'd worn to 5 funerals, 22 years ago, she felt the familiar crushing weight of survivor's guilt that had defined every moment of her existence since she was 7 years old. The studio lights felt too bright for a woman who had been living in the shadow of a tragedy that should have killed her. "What haunts you?" Steve Harvey had asked. And those 3 words unlocked a vault of guilt so deep it threatened to consume her completely. Jennifer's hands trembled as she gripped the podium, thinking about the 49 people who had died in the crash while she miraculously survived with only broken bones and burns. The silence stretched as she tried to find words for a question that had tortured her for over 2 decades. It was Wednesday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. The Walsh family had traveled from Denver, Colorado, hoping this game show might provide some joy for a woman who had never felt she deserved happiness after surviving when everyone else died. Jennifer's adoptive parents, Richard and Susan, stood behind her at the family podium, offering support for a woman who had never stopped asking why she lived when her entire biological family perished. The game had started with Jennifer's heart already heavy with guilt. The Walsh family was competing against the Chen family from California, and Steve was working his usual magic with the crowd. But Jennifer couldn't focus because every mention of family reminded her of the parents, brother and grandmother she'd lost in 30 seconds of falling through the sky. 22 years ago, 7-year-old Jennifer had been returning from visiting her grandmother in Florida with her parents, Michael and Sarah, her 4-year-old brother Tommy, and her grandmother Rose. Flight 47 was supposed to be a routine trip home to Chicago, a happy ending to a week of Disney World and beach visits. Instead, it became one of the deadliest aviation disasters in U.S. history. The plane had experienced catastrophic engine failure at 30,000 feet. Jennifer remembered the oxygen masks dropping, her mother's scared face, her father trying to remain calm while her grandmother prayed and Tommy cried. She remembered the terrible falling sensation, the screaming, and then darkness. "Why did I live when everyone else died?" Jennifer whispered into the microphone. The words came out like a confession she'd been carrying for 22 years. The studio fell completely silent as everyone processed the devastating weight of her survivor's guilt. Steve's face immediately changed as he realized the depth of trauma behind her words. This wasn't just about loss. This was about a 7-year-old girl who had survived a mass casualty event that killed her entire family. The cameras captured every emotion crossing Jennifer's face as she struggled with guilt that had shaped her entire adult life. "Tell me what happened," Steve said gently, stepping closer to Jennifer. His voice carried the weight of someone who understood that some stories required extreme care and compassion. The audience leaned forward, sensing they were about to hear something that would fundamentally challenge their understanding of survival and loss. "I was 7 years old," Jennifer began, her voice barely audible. "My whole family was on Flight 47 from Orlando to Chicago. The plane crashed in a field outside Indianapolis. 149 people died." She paused, struggling to continue with the part of the story that had haunted her every day since. "I was thrown from the wreckage during impact, broke both legs, had severe burns, was in a coma for 3 weeks. But I lived." The scope of the tragedy was hitting everyone in the studio like a physical blow. Steve could see that Jennifer wasn't just a survivor, she was a victim, carrying the guilt of being the only one spared. The audience was trying to process the magnitude of losing an entire family in one moment. "Everyone else died," Jennifer continued, tears flowing freely. "My parents, my little brother Tommy, my grandmother who had been reading me stories just hours before. I was the only survivor out of 150 people on that plane. The investigators called it a miracle," she added, her voice full of bitter irony. "But it doesn't feel like a miracle when you're the only one who gets to keep living while everyone you love is gone forever." The brutal honesty of her survivor's guilt was devastating to hear. Steve recognized that Jennifer had spent 22 years believing she didn't deserve to live when others had died. carrying a burden no child should ever have to bear. Steve Harvey made a decision that would define this moment forever. He looked directly at Jennifer and asked the question that cut to the heart of her pain. What do you think your family would want for you? The question shifted focus from her guilt to their love. I don't know, Jennifer admitted, her voice breaking. Some days I think they'd want me to be happy, to live the life they never got to have. Other days I think they'd wonder why I got to survive when they didn't. I've spent 22 years feeling guilty for breathing, Jennifer continued. Guilty for growing up, for graduating high school, for going to college, for getting married. Every milestone feels like a betrayal of their memory, because they never got those chances. The psychological burden of survivor's guilt was evident in every word Jennifer spoke. Steve could see that she had built her entire identity around the tragedy, defining herself as the girl who shouldn't have lived rather than the woman who did. Do you remember your family? Steve asked gently. The question was designed to help Jennifer connect with positive memories rather than focusing solely on the trauma of loss. Every detail, Jennifer replied immediately. My dad's laugh, my mom's perfume, the way my grandmother sang lullabies, how Tommy always stole food from my plate. Her face softened as she spoke about them, love overriding guilt for a moment. They were coming home from the best vacation we'd ever had, Jennifer continued. Tommy had met Mickey Mouse, I'd collected seashells with Grandma. We'd all been so happy. The crash happened during what should have been the perfect ending to a perfect week. The contrast between their joy before the crash and the devastation that followed made the tragedy even more heartbreaking. Steve could see that Jennifer carried not just grief, but also the weight of interrupted happiness, dreams that were cut short in mid-flight. Behind the scenes, trauma counselors who had been contacted by the production team were standing by to offer Jennifer additional support. This had gone far beyond typical game show territory into profound psychological trauma and survivor's guilt counseling. Jennifer, Steve said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, you didn't survive by accident. You didn't live because you deserved it more than they did. You lived because you had a purpose that required you to keep going. The audience began to respond with visible emotion. People throughout the studio were imagining losing their entire families in one moment, thinking about the impossible burden of being the sole survivor of such a tragedy. But what purpose could be worth their lives? Jennifer asked, the question that had tortured her for decades. What could I possibly do that would justify being the only one who got to live? You don't have to justify surviving, Steve replied firmly. Survival isn't something you earn or deserve. It's something that happens, and then you decide what to do with the gift of continued life. His words offered Jennifer a different framework for understanding her situation. What happened next would become one of the most powerful moments in television history. Steve turned to address the cameras directly, speaking to America about the hidden survivors among us. Ladies and gentlemen, this woman has been carrying survivor's guilt for 22 years. She was 7 years old when she lost everything, and she spent her entire adult life believing she didn't deserve to live, Steve continued. But survivors aren't guilty of anything except being strong enough to keep going when everything falls apart. His words elevated Jennifer's struggle into a recognition of hidden strength. The conversation continued with Steve helping Jennifer understand that her survival didn't diminish her family's memory and that living fully was actually the best way to honor their love for her. Your family loved you, Steve said. They would want you to have the life they couldn't have. Every moment of happiness you experience, every achievement you reach, every love you find, that's not betraying them. That's proving their love was powerful enough to keep you going. Jennifer's face began to change as she considered Steve's words. The guilt didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else. The possibility that her family's love might be stronger than her survivor's guilt. The audience witnessed a woman beginning to separate survival from betrayal. I dream about them every night, Jennifer revealed. Sometimes they're angry that I lived when they died. Other times they're telling me they're proud of who I've become. The dreams reflected her internal conflict between guilt and hope. Steve's response was both gentle and practical. Listen to the dreams where they're proud. That's their love speaking to you across time and death. The angry dreams are just your guilt lying to you about what love looks like. The episode would later become a resource for other soul survivors and people dealing with survivors' guilt from various tragedies. Jennifer's story showed that survival often comes with psychological burdens that require professional support and community understanding. 6 months after the taping, Jennifer had begun therapy specifically designed for survivors' guilt and trauma processing. The work was difficult but transformative, helping her separate her identity from the tragedy that had shaped her childhood. Jennifer's relationship with her adoptive parents improved as she learned to accept love without feeling guilty about receiving care that her biological family couldn't provide. Family therapy helped them all process the unique dynamics of raising a soul survivor. The Memorial Foundation, Jennifer established in her family's memory, became a resource for other families affected by aviation disasters. Her work with newly bereaved families helped her transform her survival into service for others facing similar losses. The annual memorial service Jennifer organizes for Flight 47 victims has become a gathering place for extended family members and friends who lost loved ones in the crash. The shared grief creates community and helps everyone process the magnitude of the loss. Jennifer's advocacy work with aviation safety organizations focuses on supporting families affected by crashes and improving emergency response protocols. Her experience as a soul survivor gives her unique insight into both the immediate and long-term needs of disaster victims. The relationship between Jennifer and other soul survivors from various tragedies created a network of people who understood the unique burden of being the only one who lived. These connections became lifelines during the darkest moments of guilt and isolation. Today, Jennifer works as a trauma counselor, specializing in survivors' guilt and disaster recovery. Her personal experience gives her credibility with clients who might otherwise feel judged for struggling with survival when others died. The black dress she wore that day hangs in her closet next to a photo of her biological family taken during their Disney World vacation, the last picture of them alive. Both serve as reminders of loss and love, representing the family she lost and the life she's built in their honor. The scholarship fund Jennifer established provides education grants for children who have lost parents in disasters. Each scholarship represents her family's belief in the power of education and their desire for children to have opportunities they were denied. Letters from other soul survivors arrive regularly at Jennifer's office, sharing their own struggles with guilt and seeking guidance on how to live with the burden of being the only one who survived. Her responses offer hope and practical strategies for healing. The support group Jennifer facilitates for disaster survivors helps people process the complex emotions that come with surviving when others don't. The group provides a safe space for discussing guilt, anger, gratitude, and the responsibility that comes with continued life. The research Jennifer participates in about survivors' guilt has contributed to better understanding of trauma responses and improved treatment protocols for disaster survivors. Her willingness to share her experience has advanced psychological care for others facing similar challenges. Because some survival requires a lifetime of learning how to live with it, and some gifts come wrapped in tragedies so profound, they seem like curses until time reveals their purpose. Jennifer Walsh spent 22 years believing she didn't deserve to live, but she learned that survival isn't about deserving. It's about accepting the responsibility to make meaning from the inexplicable. The miracle that happened on that Wednesday afternoon in Atlanta reminds us that some people carry burdens we can't see, guilt for gifts they never asked for, and responsibility for lives they couldn't save. Jennifer's journey from guilty survivor to purposeful advocate proved that sometimes the most profound healing comes from helping others navigate similar pain. Her story continues to educate people about the hidden struggles of disaster survivors and the importance of mental health support for people who live through tragedies that claim others. The woman who thought her survival was a mistake became proof that some lives are spared to serve purposes larger than individual understanding. The aviation industry has implemented new protocols for supporting soul survivors and their families, partly inspired by Jennifer's advocacy for comprehensive trauma care following disasters. Her experience helped create systems that address the psychological needs of survivors alongside their physical injuries. The organization Jennifer founded now operates in 12 states, providing counseling, advocacy, and community support for disaster survivors and their families. Each person helped represents proof that survival can become service and that guilt can transform into grace when properly supported and understood.